Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Jessica Madden, and I'm the facilitator for the Coastal Resilience Network, as well as the Sea Grant State Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy. The California Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We'll provide a link to the network if you'd like to join or watch past webinars, including today's, on our website. This link can be found on the follow-up email that you'll receive after today's webinar. To go into webinar logistics, we will listen and watch the presentation for about 30 to 40 minutes and follow up with a Q&A session. During the presentation, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of the Zoom screen. This webinar is being recorded, and I will make that available for your review after the webinar. Today's presentation will discuss the state of sea level rise adaptation planning on California's outer coast. We're joined today by Charles Lester, Ashley Cooper, and Samantha Rozal from UCSB's Ocean and Coastal Policy Center. Dr. Charles Lester is the director of the Ocean and Coastal Policy Center in the Marine Science Institute at UC Santa Barbara, where he researches, writes, and consults about sea level rise, coastal resilience, and other aspects of coastal law, policy, and management. Also joining us is Ashley Cooper. Ashley is the second-year Master of Environmental Science and Management student and USC Sea Grant Fellow at the UC Santa Barbara Bren School, where she specializes on coastal marine resources management. And we also have Samantha Rozal, a staff research associate at UC Santa Barbara's Ocean and Coastal Policy Center, where she's working on developing an inventory of sea level rise adaptation planning documents for the San Francisco Bay Area. Thank you for joining us today, Charles, Ashley, and Samantha. And with that, I'll pass the virtual mic over to you, Charles.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. We're happy to be here today to talk about this work. It's been a couple of years now that we've been working on this project. It's funding from the Ocean Protection Council, and also in conjunction with USC Sea Grant for some of the research components. And we started this project, as I said, a couple of years ago, wanting to ask, what is the status of sea level rise adaptation planning on California's coast? And as Jessica said, it's focused on the outer coast. And so one of the things that we did first was to begin creating an inventory of what the activities actually are. And so when you look at our outer coast on the right-hand side here, there are 76 local jurisdictions, counties, and cities that are in the coastal zone in part. And so the project is focused on those 76 local government jurisdictions, at least right now. So we started this inventory, and I think Jessica's going to put some links in the chat. One to the story map, which is, you see the opening screen on the upper left, which is an overview of the project, and then a link to the inventory at the end of the story map. She'll also put in a link, I think, directly to the inventory. Down on the lower left is just an example of the coastal zone in California, which is defined by statute in the California Coastal Act, and it does vary up and down the coastline. So the jurisdictions that we were looking at depended on where those jurisdictions sat within the coastal zone. So for example, on the lower left, you can see Morro Bay, and the coastal zone boundary essentially includes most of the watershed, which is not a frequent occurrence in California, but there are some cases like that. As opposed to on the right, you see the coastal zone boundary in city of Los Angeles border with Malibu, and you can see how it drops down to much closer to the shoreline in the urban area. And we can talk more about the reasons for that later if people are interested. So we started building this inventory, and then we started collecting information about all the activity that was happening within these jurisdictions in order to begin understanding, well, how are we doing? So in terms of the coastline on the outer coast, there's about 1.5 million acres of land, plus the water side out to 3 miles. You can see from this pie chart that in terms of the management authority, most of that land is managed by the counties, 15 counties, The cities have another 10% of that land management authority. And then there's another 16, 17% or so that is not covered by cities and counties. So one of the things we're doing this year, we have some additional funding. We'll be completing the build out of the inventory for ports and university lands and also federal lands, which encompass about 17% of our coastal zone. So for example, the military bases, national parks, national forest lands. There's also a very small amount of tribal land in the coastal zone, which we'll also be completing in the inventory. And then going further into the year, we're also adding the San Francisco Bay Area to the inventory. So that will be the major part of the effort in the coming year. So this is the distribution of the land management authority. And as I said, we focused on the counties and the cities. And this was mostly to take stock of where are we after this period of funding that we've had. And some of you may know, we really initiated the investment in sea level rise adaptation planning back in 2013, 2014, when the Coastal Commission got its first grants out to local governments to begin this planning. And you can see that this has steadily increased, and now we're up to, as of the end of last year, about $20 million and almost 100 grants. And I'm sure that's already been exceeded given the funding that's continued to flow and is going to increase. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. So we've had a lot of investment in adaptation planning. What have we done with that? The evaluation is really straightforward in one sense. We focused on a linear decision process or model of how adaptation planning is happening. We looked at whether there were goals and visioning taking place, vulnerability assessment, followed by adaptation planning, and then policy decision. In this case, the update of local coastal programs, more on that later. But looking at that linear process within the larger setting of civic engagement, public awareness, education, and also the geopolitical settings, which we know is quite diverse up and down our coast. On the right-hand side, you can see some examples of some of the representations of this planning process that are out there from OPR and the Coastal Commission and the general planning process. They're all essentially the same kind of sequence of steps, analytic steps, and the relationship between them, often emphasizing the feedback loop. One of the goals that we looked at in this project was this notion of an actionable sea level rise adaptation plan. And building off of OPC and some of their policy objectives and their strategic plan, asking this question: to what extent are we seeing actionable sea level rise adaptation plans that prioritize the protection of nature and social equity? So that's the overall methodological framework. To cut to the chase, and the big story, I guess, or big conclusion is that overall, I think we have accomplished a lot. We have done a lot, but we have way more to do. So when you think about the challenge that we're facing with sea level rise and climate change, there's no question that we've made a lot of progress, but there is significantly more left on the horizon. In terms of those three major phases, if you look at this chart, about 2/3 of our local governments have completed vulnerability assessments. Adaptation planning, about 1/3. And in terms of LCP updates, which again, the local coastal programs are the authoritative land use planning documents in the coastal zone, we have a lot more work to do there, and we'll return to that in a minute. So with that kind of background, I'd like to pass it over to Sam, and she's going to talk a little bit about the vulnerability assessment stage of this process.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Charles. As Charles mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit about vulnerability assessments. This graph that we see here shows the number of vulnerability assessments completed by year. We can see that there's a cluster of assessments being completed in the years 2016 to 2019. And this increase from 2014 and 2015 might have been a result of the increase in state funding that Charles had mentioned earlier, along with an increase in guidance that was occurring in these years prior. However, looking at the total number of vulnerability assessments is only part of the story. Next slide, please. When we take a deeper look at the composition of vulnerability assessments, we see that they come in a variety of forms. Some common forms of vulnerability assessments might include local hazard mitigation plans. FEMA hazard mitigation requirements have meant that 73 out of 76 coastal jurisdictions have created a local hazard mitigation plan or have been a part of a multi-jurisdictional local hazard mitigation plan. They might also come in the form of assessments to comply with SB 379, which is a mandate that instructs cities to update their general plan safety elements to address climate adaptation. Or they might also have been assessments to comply with AB 691, which is a mandate that trustees of state tidelands conduct sea level rise vulnerability assessments for these. However, as you can see in the chart, the production of sea level rise vulnerability assessments is uneven. Many jurisdictions have completed a standalone assessment, while some have completed multiple assessments or even updated or refined prior assessments. Other jurisdictions may or may not have had more than beyond the simple treatment that we might find in a local hazard mitigation plan, and some of them have a combination of these things. It's also worth noting that the scale within the production of these assessments is also variable. Some vulnerability assessments might be multi-jurisdictional, some may be more at a community level, and even down for an individual asset, such as a beach, a wetland, or some type of built infrastructure. Overall, an analysis of the vulnerability assessment work along the outer coast reveals the complexity of planning that is occurring. However, regardless of their complexity, the sheer volume of vulnerability assessments that have been created should be considered a success of adaptation planning to date. I want to take a second now to look at the application of sea level rise, to talk about the application of sea level rise science to vulnerability assessments. When we think of sea level rise science, one of the first things that comes to mind is sea level rise projections under different climate scenarios. They're often made for specific time horizons, for example, 2030, 2050, 2100. This is a heat map that shows the range and distribution of sea level rise projections used along the outer coast. It is overlaid with the sea level rise projections under a high, intermediate, and low emission scenario that were developed for the 2022 NOAA technical report. And those are the red, green, and blue points/lines that you see on the chart. And you can also see the OPC guidance as outlined in the state agency action plans for 2030 and 2100. Those are the black dots on the line. On the heat map itself, the way you read it is that the darker the square, the more jurisdictions have used that projection. So for example, the dark blue square on the bottom left corner shows approximately 30 jurisdictions are using projections between 0 and 1 feet for the year 2030. We can see that most used projections cluster along the median, intermediate, and high projection curves. We also see that there are relatively fewer assessments that have used projections at or near the higher targets set in the state agency action plan for 2050, whereas more use projections closer to the action plan target of 6 feet by sea level rise by 2100. And just taking a comprehensive view, we can see that there's a huge range of projections that are being used in jurisdictions, which highlights the complexity and variety of sea level rise science that are being used to make vulnerability assessments. Next slide, please. Focus groups and mixed method surveys that were used in creating this report also highlight issues in the application of sea level rise science. Here are some responses to the mixed method survey that highlight how complicated and difficult it is to apply sea level rise science into vulnerability assessments and adaptation planning at large. This includes things such as difficulty understanding the complexity of the projections. There's multiple scenarios and probabilities, and choosing one or deciding which one to use can be confusing. There can be unclear guidance. There can be frustration with constantly changing sea level rise science and applying new science to assessments that are already happening, and the fear of new science from diminishing the work of previous science. There's also a need for more locally scaled models. A quote from one of the focus groups kind of sums up these difficulties. It states, "I feel like sea level rise planning is like flying the ship as you build it, or flying the plane as you build it." Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly what is in some of these vulnerability assessments. There's a wide range of community assets that are vulnerable to sea level rise. The most commonly cited in these vulnerability assessments are public shoreline access, recreation and facilities, followed closely by coastal habitat, species, and ecology. Other things that are include hard infrastructure like highways, roads, wastewater, and drinking water facilities. Beaches, along with wetlands, which I'll talk about shortly, are among the 5 facilities that were most commonly cited, which bodes well for the goal of having adaptation plans that prioritize the protection of nature. Unfortunately, these beach vulnerability assessments show the gradual and increasing loss of beach without intervention, as you can see from some of these charts and graphs here that have been taken from some of the vulnerability assessments. Next slide. We see a similar phenomenon occurring with wetlands, where vulnerability assessments reveal the gradual loss of wetlands due to sea level rise with the conversion of marsh habitat to open water. We can see this on a series of photos on the left-hand side. These are showing Humboldt Bay under a scenario with dike failure. We initially see the immediate conversion to mudflats, followed later by the landscape being classified as open water. Next slide. Finally, I want to touch a little bit more on the environmental justice portion of vulnerability assessments. Ashley's going to talk about the integration of equity and the adaptation planning at large in a bit, but I just want to have us thinking a little bit about it now. We want to share a very poignant quote from one of our focus groups. It reads, "When I first started hearing about these vulnerability assessments several years back, I was kind of shocked because it seemed like the focus was on what property might be lost instead of thinking about vulnerable peoples." This brings up the question, how are we considering social vulnerability and socially vulnerable communities in adaptation planning? And how can we do a better job at ensuring the most vulnerable communities, including the ones that are historically underrepresented in adaptation planning, are truly being considered? Some jurisdictions are already doing this. For example, the city of Hermosa Beach combines various social indicators such as demographics, mobility, housing type, and homelessness, mental and physical impairment, and resident/visitor status into a social vulnerability index that they use in their vulnerability assessment. The city of Santa Cruz also considers social vulnerability and considerable depth at a local level, combining local indicators of vulnerability at a city block group level. These included an income below the median income, elderly, language limitations, disability, and crime incidents. Hopefully, as we continue to do adaptation planning in the future, we see more and more jurisdictions taking meaningful steps to address social vulnerability. Now, this is a little bit of the tapestry of adaptation planning that we're going along. I've just talked about the vulnerability assessments, which is the light blue area in this kind of flow chart of adaptation planning. I'm now going to pass it along to Ashley, who's going to talk more about the adaptation planning process.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, so as Sam and Charles have both mentioned, following vulnerability assessment, the next step in the adaptation planning process is to complete adaptation plans before ultimately moving on to developing local coastal programs. As of this past summer, only 22 coastal jurisdictions have completed their adaptation plans, with an additional 3 plans pending completion. Effectively, 2/3 of all coastal jurisdictions, or 67%, have not yet started their adaptation plans. Over the past year, the Ocean and Coastal Policy Center, in conjunction with the University of Southern California Sea Grant, administered a survey of nearly 500 coastal practitioners, interested persons, and professionals. This effort marks the 4th in a series of longitudinal surveys conducted since 2006, and its results offer a current snapshot of adaptation needs and challenges along the California coastline. While 272 respondents offered information about the status of adaptation planning in their respective communities, nearly 1 in 5 individuals indicated that they either had no opinion about the success of adaptation planning or simply did not know. Of the 219 individuals who had an opinion about the status of adaptation planning, roughly 2/3 felt that adaptation planning had been somewhat successful, and nearly 1/3 felt that adaptation planning had been unsuccessful altogether. And only 3% of respondents believed that the process had been very successful and helpful. Next slide. This begs the question, what does successful adaptation planning look like? Typically, when we discuss adaptation planning, we talk about 3 broad categories: protect, accommodate, and retreat. As you can see here, the IPCC identifies 6 categories with the addition of no response, advance, and ecosystem-based adaptation. But as we found in our research, the tapestry of adaptation planning is much more nuanced than simply 3 or even 6 categories. For example, in the bottom part of the screen, you can see an excerpt from the County of Marin's 2018 Sea Level Rise Adaptation Report. And it shows it shows a suite of adaptation planning strategies to be used in conjunction with each other, from hard infrastructure to natural infrastructure, and from policy changes to floodproofing. So as we think about adaptation planning, scale is critically important. Sea level rise planning takes place along a continuum with parcel by parcel planning at one end and up to a federal scale at the other end. In 2021, the city of Pacifica examined various adaptation interventions, including development setbacks, easements, and beach and dune nourishment, to name a few. And they cataloged the pros and cons for each intervention, followed by evaluating its local suitability across 8 different neighborhoods. Inherent in this assessment is the acknowledgement that what works for one neighborhood may not work for another location. There's no simple panacea when planning for sea level rise. Next slide, please. And as many of you guys are probably aware, although managed retreat is a rather contentious issue, it is an important part of adaptation planning discussions, and it has been incorporated into numerous adaptation plans to date. On the left, in the upper part of your screen, you can see part of Santa Monica's 2020 Sea Level Rise Assessment Report, which outlines the costs associated with a managed retreat adaptation pathway, including demolishing and relocating infrastructure. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see part of Imperial Beach's adaptation planning, which represents an early effort to analyze managed retreat, including a lease buyback option whereby the city would purchase vulnerable properties and then lease them back to recoup expenses before ultimately retiring the properties. And lastly, on the right-hand side of your screen, we have the City of Coronado's adaptation strategy, which includes 153 explicit references to managed retreat and analyzes the benefits of retreat for 3 of 10 adaptation action areas as indicated in this diagram. California's adaptation planning efforts can benefit greatly from explicitly considering development and climate change impacts to historically disadvantaged populations, including communities of color, lower income communities, and tribes. A recent review of adaptation planning documents for the state ranked jurisdictions' environmental justice considerations along a scale from 0, meaning that they did not consider environmental justice topics, to 3, meaning the plans considered these topics strongly, directly, and in depth, including intentional plans, strategies, or recommendations. And this assessment evaluated jurisdictions both with and without disadvantaged communities and found that the most common score for both types of jurisdictions was 1, or effectively that these plans considered environmental justice topics indirectly or briefly. And these results corroborate our survey results, where only a quarter of respondents had reviewed community adaptation plans that address impacts to historically disadvantaged communities. A through line through adaptation planning are the questions of who is involved and who should be involved. As one focus group respondent observed, coastal communities are often viewed as the primary stakeholder in adaptation planning because they live along the shoreline. However, the coast is a public resource held in public trust, and there's a need for us to re-envision the definition of what a stakeholder is to better reflect this reality. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the results from survey respondents who were asked to identify the top 3 groups of stakeholders currently involved in coastal or shoreline hazards management. That includes sea level rise, erosion, flooding, sediment management. And of these various stakeholder groups listed, 66% of respondents identified local governments as a key stakeholder, 61% identified state agencies, and then 35% identified scientists and engineers and property owners, respectively. Rounding out the top 5 were environmental groups identified by roughly a third of respondents. In addition to the groups listed on the screen, other options or responses included chambers of commerce, small businesses, tribal governments and indigenous peoples, and BIPOC community members, which were selected by 1% of respondents. And then not reflected in our results were commercial resource users, trade and professional organizations, and lower income community members. So this work really underscores the idea that the coastal stakeholder is not a single entity and that planning efforts need to consider how to bring in a broader population. With the understanding that social engagement needs to be more than just a checkbox when folks are, writing their adaptation plans in order to incorporate all voices within the adaptation planning process, engagement needs to really be iterative and ongoing. And while this may not have always been the case in adaptation planning efforts, the landscape is starting to shift. So on the left, we have an excerpt from the County of Santa Barbara's Climate Adaptation Resilience Plan, which is currently being drafted and includes numerous opportunities for sustained engagement. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see an image from the City of Santa Cruz's plan for community engagement, where engagement is circular and feedback is incorporated at multiple stages within the planning process. And so in the vein of iterative processes and sustained adaptation dialogues, I'm going to pass the baton back to Charles, and he's going to discuss adaptation pathways with you all.
Great, thanks, Ashley. So one of the themes that you're probably aware of that's becoming increasingly discussed is this idea of adaptation pathways. And so we took a look at the extent to which pathways were being incorporated or addressed or thought about within the adaptation planning that was going on. These are just a couple of images, again, from the city of Santa Cruz, which conveys this idea of a pathway where you are identifying your resources that are vulnerable and then strategies to address those vulnerabilities, but you're keying off of these potential triggers for action. So, for example, the beach width, if that's something that the community is concerned about, you might monitor that beach width over time, and then when it reaches a certain threshold or trigger point, you would take your adaptation action. So on the right-hand side here, you see some of the examples that Santa Cruz was considering for temporal triggers, like a future time horizon, environmental change as a trigger, structural change as a trigger. So we looked at the extent to which this was being used, and it is being talked about somewhat frequently or increasingly. These are a couple examples: City of Coronado on the left and County of Ventura on the right. And if you look at this county chart, basically you see the timeline down on the bottom here representing out to 2100, approximate sea level rise numbers here correlated to those timeframes up to 5 feet. But overlaying this particular area, Hollywood Beach, you see them characterizing or projecting a pathway that might begin with dune restoration, a implementation of an action, monitoring a trigger like storm waves overtopping the beaches, followed by more planning to do that extended dune restoration, followed by another trigger of flood insurance claims, for example, which would then trigger your next action of building out an increased adaptation measure like a dune in this case, or they refer to shoreline perpendicular devices, might that be a groin? So the idea is that you're sequencing different interventions into the future based on changes that you observe. The city of Del Mar didn't talk specifically about adaptation pathways, but I think it's one of the good examples of how this thinking has been playing out in some of the adaptation plans. And so many of you probably know Del Mar has this very popular sandy beach. It gets a lot of recreational use, both from within the city and without. One of the criteria or objectives that they laid out in their planning process was this notion of a walkable beach. We'd like to keep a walkable beach. Well, you can see on the left-hand side here, this is the beach at King Tide a couple of years ago, and it's at certain points, it's not actually walkable now. So there's a significant issue here. The strategy that city talked about was periodic sand replenishment, which is represented by this graph on the upper right. The notion that here's our acceptable risk threshold. When we exceed that, we'll need to supplement the beach with sand. Then that will decline, and we'll need to do that periodically. They have recently gotten investment to do that first chunk of sand replenishment. But the idea would be to take repetitive action over time to maintain that threshold. However, they also talk about lead times for moving to that next step in the pathway. So, for example, if beach and dune nourishment or raising the seawalls is not maintaining that level of risk reduction, they might have to eventually elevate structures and maybe even relocate public infrastructure in this case. So a sequence of interventions triggered by their concern for the idea of a walkable beach. So let's move into LCP planning for a minute. And some of you may know that the LCP process has been around for 40 plus years under our Coastal Act. On the left-hand side, you can see a graph representing the number of local jurisdictions that actually have a certified or approved LCP from the State Coastal Commission. And you may not know that some local governments actually still don't have a certified LCP, even though the mandate was originally due in 1981. So we do have some work to do to complete some jurisdictions' LCPs, but in terms of updating those LCPs, and there is legislation pending. I haven't seen anything on the last day or two, but I think it's on the governor's desk that would potentially up the ante and require these sea level rise updates to LCPs to happen. We took a couple of questions into the survey about LCPs. This chart on the right shows you that a fair number of people don't think that LCPs currently address sea level rise adaptation sufficiently, hence we need to update them. They also feel that the sea level rise adaptation is not being adequately addressed at the statewide level, and similarly that local concerns are not being overly focused on through that LCP planning. But the bottom line of the survey was that people do embrace the concept of updating an LCP to deal with this issue. The challenge has been that it's been very difficult to get that done. And so for a lot of reasons, which we can talk about later if you want, it's can be controversial. These are some of the updates that we looked at of different types. And I think the message here is that simply to say that an LCP is updated is not the whole story. The devil's in the details. Some of these, for example, are comprehensive land use planning updates where the jurisdiction has taken a complete look at their land use policies, programs, projections, changed ordinances, etc. Others, however, are targeted updates of like a single segment. So the Crescent City Harbor segment. Ocean Beach Master Plan is a comprehensive update of that segment of San Francisco's coast. The Bayfront Master Plan is also a comprehensive update of a segment in Chula Vista. On the other hand, other LCPs like the City of Crescent City very early on simply updated a couple policies that reference sea level rise. So a variety of different kinds of updates, but there's significantly more left to happen. So when we take a step back and again to this tapestry of the whole process, and we created an index of activity, you can see that the number of jurisdictions over here on the right that have actually gone through this sequence of functional steps, vulnerability assessment, adaptation planning, LCP updates, is not very high. There are quite a few jurisdictions in the middle here, maybe poised to move into that last phase, but also quite a few that have yet to really move out of the starting gates in terms of their vulnerability stage. So a mixed bag of success so far. Some of the things that we look at in the report with respect to LCP planning, how can we do a better job? This is something that some of you probably know I've been thinking about for a long time. How do you get an LCP done effectively? There's an inherent tension between statewide and local objectives. That was one of the main points of having a Coastal Act, was to animate that discussion and implement statewide policy through local land use plans and ordinances. These are some best practices that were developed at the Coastal Commission about how to front load that process, have a more meaningful engagement and dialogue between state and local interests around how an LCP should actually address an issue. It's not rocket science. It's sitting down at the table and talking it through, hashing it out. Again, there's a lot to talk about there, which we can get back to later if you want. So this idea of actionable planning is something that has been really important for me to think about and play out a little bit, tease out. And so we create this flow diagram in the report. And one way to think about it is going back to that Del Mar example. And what would it mean to have an actionable plan? Well, if you go to the Coastal Act, for example, on the upper left and think about the overall objective, we've said for the state to protect maximum public access. In the case of Del Mar, they have an LCP policy, for example, that might be maintain a walkable beach. You could then assess the vulnerability of that. Beach erosion is going to change the ability to have that walkable beach. Put in place an LCP standard, maintain a specific beach width, for example. The strategy would be, what are those actions that you can implement to maintain that specific beach width, like replenishment, sand retention, living shorelines, managed retreat. Those things feed into actions which you take. You then monitor the thresholds for change around that objective, implement more monitoring and actions as needed to maintain that threshold. Of course, in order to make this real or actionable, you need to actually think about, what is the action, how much is it going to cost, who's going to do it, and when are they going to do it. So we do see some jurisdictions like San Francisco, Santa Cruz, Santa Barbara, putting these strategies into their capital improvement plans. And that, I think, is an important point. Some of the adaptation planning that is happening is really quite general, and the jurisdictions are not getting down to the level of, well, how would you actually make this happen? So this is a sequence going from the overall objective of a policy area and monitoring that change over time, triggering actions and funding it and scheduling it, and then reevaluating it. So really a series of feedback loops going through from general to specific action. And last thing I would say about this idea of pathways and doing things that are actionable is, one of the things I think we need to be concerned about is the extent to which we're actually keeping in mind our visions for the future coast. And so adaptation pathways in some cases seem to be embraced as a way of dealing with the future uncertainty, and, oh, let's punt that decision to the next decision tree sometime in the future. But what's critical is to have some notion of, well, what is it that you're trying to achieve through that pathway? I think a pathway approach without a vision might turn into wandering. So another issue that we looked at was this question of scale. Again, in California, we've seen movements in two directions. Some people are saying we need to go regional, sub-regional, a larger scale to do our adaptation planning. Others saying we need to go to the neighborhood scale, the other direction. This is one example of what it might mean to think regionally. In the Santa Barbara littoral cell, these white sand sheds or watersheds, coastal watersheds, are where the sand is operating physically. You need to think about that. The green hexagons are the demand shed for public access to these beaches, a different geography entirely. And then the coastal zone is just this little blue strip down here along the edge. So in order to do this kind of planning, you're going to really need to engage the different actors at different scales across this larger geography. If the question you're grappling with is, what's going to happen with public access at the beaches as sea level rise continues? Going the other direction, neighborhood scale planning, we've already been doing planning through the LCP process at a neighborhood scale and in general plans. Many local jurisdictions structure their communities through these neighborhood scale segments. This is City of Pacifica on the right, for example, that you saw in the earlier chart, City of Santa Barbara on the left. So we have opportunities and we know how to do planning at this scale. Some people are wanting to go that direction to make the engagement with public participation, the ability to manage an issue, how easy it is to get your arms around the dynamics that are happening at a smaller scale. So we also looked at this question of funding, and at the beginning I started by pointing out we'd made all these great investments. What have we been doing with them? Well, we're in this phase now where there's just tons of money, $100 million at OPC, $30 million at the Coastal Commission, over $300 million at the Conservancy. We need to make sure that the spending of this funding is done wisely. And so we talked a little bit about how might that happen if we had a statewide strategy for spending that money around the question of adaptation. For example, OPC might focus on visioning and engagement that supports vulnerability assessments, adaptation planning, LCP work by the Coastal Commission that leads to conservancy investment in projects that have been well imagined and articulated and strategized through the other funding measures. So a real need to integrate our funding strategies. The report also includes at the back end a bunch of examples of what we might call best practices, or the best practices that we've seen so far along these different dimensions of sea level rise planning. So sea level rise science, how to do vulnerability assessments, adaptation pathways, comprehensive planning, etc. So for the last slide here, just to conclude, we do have some recommendations at the back of the report. They range from specific suggestions about how to update or change the law to address adaptation planning more directly, for example, protection of cultural resources or enhancing equity in the process, but also completing LCP updates like the SB 272 that's already pending, integrated funding strategies, investing in sand management better and integrating that sand management into the adaptation process, et cetera. And I'm happy to talk about those in more detail. One of the things in particular that we focus on is this idea of real estate disclosure at a statewide level, and refer to the activity and the action that was taken in the state of Hawaii, where they actually now have a requirement at the state level for risk disclosure in real estate transactions around sea level rise. And something I think we could really benefit from in California. So that's the overview. Sorry, Jessica, we came in 4 minutes over maybe, but we look forward to your questions and lively conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to send a link in the chat right now to the full report. There's a lot of amazing resources in there, as we could see from your slides. So definitely check that out if you want a bit more detail on all the great topics we discussed today. So now is time for our Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand, or you can put your question in the Q&A box that should be available to you. And I will get to your questions as they come up. But as we're waiting for folks to put their questions in the Q&A, I have a few. So I know at the Coastal Conservancy and other funding agencies that you mentioned, with the increased funding for sea level rise adaptation in the recent years, we're really interested in this idea of actionable planning as a way to ensure good investment of state dollars in sea level rise adaptation planning. So I loved the flow chart you provided. I think that's a really nice way to sort of lay out how does an actionable plan, an actionable pathway happen. Could you speak a bit more about how adaptation pathways can develop actions and a vision that integrates social vulnerability and the wide diversity of stakeholders that you mentioned into the whole process? So like, how do you come up with actions that represent all the folks that use coastal resources? In your experience looking at so many different adaptation planning documents.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the question and the challenge. We didn't talk a lot about capacity in this overview, but one of the things I was struck by in the research was capacity is an issue for everyone, and it's not just the state agency or the local governments that need more staff or more funding. It's everyone involved in the process. And so even if they aren't involved enough, and that's one of the things we found, they also don't have enough capacity to be more involved necessarily. And so how do you invest in the right ways and the right processes that will actually expand engagement in order to do what you asked about, right? If you want to have everyone's concerns reflected in these actions, they all need to be engaged. in some meaningful way. And so I think it's a loop between investing in engagement, but also thinking about how does that engagement happen, and then over time making sure that it's iterative. We don't talk enough about, I think, that the communities are dynamic also, and how you vision your community is changing depending on who's involved and what's happening to the resources and the infrastructure and the economy and all of the things that shape what happens at a community level. Those are always changing. And so it's important that the vision at the top be engaged in through the implementation process to the bottom and then back again as things change. And so let's take West Cliff Drive in Santa Cruz, for example, which has been an active discussion. There's a complicated set of actors there, and it's not just people who live in Santa Cruz or on West Cliff Drive. There are a lot of people who want to continue to enjoy the access resources there, which may disappear if we don't vision how are we going to maintain them and then create actions that would actually achieve that over time. So it's not an easy community dialogue. A lot of disagreements or different perspectives on how to do that. But we need to figure out how to put in place an ongoing activated process, I think, that's always going to be available.
Yeah, it sounds like that iterative approach and like circling back and making sure that this whole pathway is dynamic and reflecting the community values even as they shift through time. That's a really great thought.
I don't know if Ashley or Sam had anything to add to that. Okay.
Thank you. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A. We have one from Olivia Zimmerman. So Charles mentioned that there are inherent differences between priorities of state and local governments in sea level rise planning. Can you elaborate on this, please? I imagine this varies by locality. Do you have any examples you can share and how these tensions were addressed?
No, I can't think of any. Having lived those for 20 years, yes. If I said inherent differences, I may have misspoke. I meant inherent tensions between state interests and local interests. And so the best example probably is public access generally. And then if we think about what often happens at the local level, sometimes, and understandably so, neighborhoods or residential areas don't necessarily want to be inundated or overrun with the public using the shoreline resources at the expense of parking, for example, on the neighborhood streets. Those kinds of tensions that we see really consistently up and down the coast. And so a local government or a local community might have a parochial interest in the sense of being motivated by local concern for the character and quality of the local experience, parochially interested in managing the ability to park in neighborhoods in order to minimize impacts to people who live there. Whereas the state, the Coastal Commission, is coming in with a mandate to maximize public access to the shoreline, and they're going to want to open up that neighborhood. So that's just kind of a simple example, but it's often a tension between private interests that are sometimes prioritized by local or private local interests prioritized by the community versus a statewide broader interest, people who aren't in the community. That makes sense.
Yeah.
There's often local interests in economic development too, which is important, right? We all want to have sustainable economic investment in local communities, but sometimes the development-driven interests in economic expansion conflict with a statewide interest in protecting a habitat or a wetland or a beach. Mm-hmm. So there's a creative dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Lots of variables at play, I'm sure. Great. We have another question from Destiny Preston. I appreciate the discussion on a regional approach that illustrates access sheds. I recall the slide that discussed DACs. Can you speak more to that and what data was utilized to determine what constitutes a DAC? For the jurisdictions without DACs, was the fact that DACs may still have close ties to these areas, either through historic relationships with the coast, especially applicable to tribes, or inland communities who visit these coastal access points? I think that what I'm hoping to understand is how we can still consider this when we're examining planning for coastal communities that do not technically have a DAC within their jurisdictional border. It's a great question.
I'm happy to take a crack at this. Oh, sorry, my lights just went out in this room. So the data that was used was from, let me pull this up. It was from Senate Bill 535, which essentially defined disadvantaged communities according to census tracts with the highest quartile of scores from Cal EnviroScreen, tracts that were missing data altogether, and census tracts identified in the 2017 disadvantaged community designation, as well as lands under the control of federally recognized tribes. As for whether or not, the second part of your question, as for whether or not the fact that disadvantaged communities may or may not have close ties with the land or with resources within these jurisdictions, that was not explicitly evaluated within that analysis. But your question is a great question, and I think it gets at the overall kind of reimagining of who the coastal stakeholder is. Whether that's in these planning processes, specifically going and looking at the tribal lands that you're on and trying to engage current tribal members in the process outside of just, a comment period, but in terms of decision making. We evaluated within our survey different ways that individuals are bringing environmental justice considerations and specifically tribal engagement into adaptation planning. And I'm happy to circulate that afterwards, or have, I'm happy to circulate that afterwards, and so that you can take a deeper dive into that.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, if you send me the link, I can provide that in the follow-up email for folks to look at.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, we have another question from Destiny. Did you consider regional authorities such as JPAs, MPOs, and RTPAs? Those are joint powers authorities, metropolitan planning organizations, and regional transportation planning agencies. I'll note that there are other funding sources in addition to those provided by OPC, SCC, and the Coastal Commission. OPR, the government's Office of Planning and Research, and Caltrans offer other funding opportunities to advance climate adaptation planning for regional agencies, as well as cities, counties, and tribes.
I'd say we dabbled a little bit in the regional details. There's some discussion of regional collaboratives, and the scale question again brought up these different opportunities like JPAs, or the Santa Barbara area, Beacon is a JPA that is operating there, a potential management authority for adaptation planning, or SANDAG. So we did ask that question, but we didn't have the time or the resources to get into detail on evaluating the role of those, at least so far, as opposed to focusing on what the counties and cities were doing through their adaptation planning processes. I think the point about funding is a good one, and the analysis mostly focused on those big three state entities in the coastal zone on the outer coast. But yes, there are other sources of funding, and to me that makes the challenge even more important to focus on how to do an integrated funding strategy, because it's not just a dialogue between those three agencies. Many of you probably know that there is this 17 agency state agency task force or a working group around sea level rise. And so if we really need to look at all of those players and ask how are they strategizing their financing and funding what are they funding? How does it relate to what everyone else is funding? And make sure that it is integrated.
Thanks, Charles. We have another question from Charlotte Dorn. In the report, do you evaluate or discuss what it looks like to successfully address sea level rise through LCP policies? I imagine there is a wide range in how actionable, how rooted in the findings of the vulnerability assessment, and how feasible these policies are. Any further perspectives on the defining and measuring of implementation success?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So different answers. One is that we didn't have, again, the scope of the study was not able to dive into a policy analysis of each of these LCPs and comparing outcomes at a level of detail where you might say, oh, this one is doing a better job than that one, as opposed to a broader procedural assessment of what are the outcomes on this planning step so far. So the simple measure, updated or not, yes or no, and then what kinds of updates. So what I talked about for a minute on the table, sort of the depth and the nature of these updates that are happening. And so that's some of the evaluation. So for example, the city of Half Moon Bay did a comprehensive land use plan update. They looked at all of their land use designations, land use planning trends, what's happening in the community, where do we need to plan for change that's not accommodated for now, and update the plan accordingly to anticipate that. So they did that, but they also did the policy update. So what should our policies and ordinances say about, or in this case, land use policies say about erosion on the shoreline, how development needs to think about that, put in a policy that requires risk disclosure, for example. So a pretty detailed incorporation of standards that arguably are the right ways to approach these questions in an LCP. Others are simply, updating a hazard setback policy, for example, to say, use a setback for the life of the development, taking into account future sea level rise. End of discussion, but no land use planning per se of, okay, well, where are those properties? How are they going to change? The kind of depth that would come out of a vulnerability assessment and an adaptation strategy that might then be realized in an updated set of land use designations, maps, resource evaluations, policies, programs, et cetera, in an LCP. So there's another study out there for somebody who wants to do that. And we could talk about details in any given case too about what success looks like. Going back to the question earlier about inherent state and local tensions, that is one of the issues about what is success in a policy level. The state might think it's a success to have policies in place that are going to prevent seawalls in most cases. Someone else might say, well, no, if we don't have a policy that allows seawalls, that's going to be a failure because all of this development will be endangered. So there are tensions on the substance of those policies too. The last point I would make is, and I think this is an issue for a lot of the work we're doing in this space, adaptation space, which is how do we know we're going to be successful? Well, we're planning for adaptation over the next 10 to 50 to 100 years. When will we know is that successful? Right? Can we really evaluate the success of a nature-based solution in a 3-year study? I think we'll know maybe 30 years from now, some relative success of the adaptation activity. So I think it's a dilemma for us as people who evaluate policy interventions and whether they're working or not. We'll see.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept to think about what is success, and how different perspectives would bring you to different answers to that question. So yeah, thank you for that.
And just on that point, I think it goes back to what I was trying to say earlier about how community visions and values and realization of those visions and values is also a changing thing, right? So what we might say is successful today might not look successful in 30 years, or we might have a different notion of it. Again, not to get too philosophical or deep about it, but I think these questions, especially along the shoreline, and given what we anticipate might happen, force us to confront certain scenarios, which we may right now think, oh, that would be a disaster, but maybe we have to adjust our expectations and values of what a resilient shoreline is. So maybe there will be places where the beach is not going to be there. But that's the challenge I think we're facing in any number of cases, is how do we set up community processes to help us figure that out and get to where we collectively want to be.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'm going to move on because we have more great questions for you. We have blocked off until 12:30, so please keep entering your questions into the Q&A box. Our next question is, should we continue to put lots of state funding into local planning, or shift to state visioning and project funding implementation? So I guess that's kind of asking, like, should we shift from a local scale to funding more statewide visioning and project funding?
I don't think so. I think we need to do both. But I would say, the way we've gone about this in California, and I think many places, is to recognize the importance of statewide policies and goals that we all, the majority of us, care about and want to keep realizing, like protecting public access for everyone, protecting natural resources on the shoreline, providing for developments that need to be along the shoreline, these things that are shared values. So in that sense, we need to keep investing in the agencies that help us keep those front and center. And we probably could use a little bit more of that to support the integration, but OPC does have $100 million lined up there to do lots of interesting work, I think. But at the same time, our coastline is so diverse and communities are so diverse that we need to keep investing in the capacity to do this kind of work at meaningful local scales. And going back to that question about capacity, we need a lot of resources. There's just so much that is not being done and that could be done, that need for investment at the local level is not going away, I don't think. So it's really both. And hopefully this situation we have right now will be able to continue it in terms of the money available. But in my career, this is kind of unprecedented. So we'll see if it persists.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciated one of your first slides that kind of showed that steady increase in grant funding and investment in sea level rise planning. I think it's really interesting to think about that, especially as someone who's early in their career coming into this world, in this field as it is now. It's a fascinating time, and there's a lot of opportunity right now to make some real.
Absolutely. When you put it that way, all of the young people coming into the field need to strike while this iron is hot. That's coming from someone who, worked for the state when we had furloughs because of the budget deficit. So, we weren't doling out grants. We were going home without pay. So
very different.
Take advantage of this moment.
Great. Yeah, I want to highlight one of Destiny's comments just in reference to the earlier discussion about disadvantaged communities. Cal EnviroScreen is not the most effective tool for the North Coast. That still operates as disadvantaged, yet does not suffer the same pollution burdens. So I want to make sure that that comment is.
Okay. And can I just comment on that too? Sam may want to say something also about that, which is I think part of the point we make in the study is that this idea of vulnerability, social vulnerability really needs to be teased out and developed more at a local scale, because I agree that these census-based, maps don't necessarily get to the deeper nature of what it means to be vulnerable and where people are vulnerable. So I think that was what Sam was showing in those two slides, right?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about in the slides a bit. And I also do want to add, there is a certain level of tension. There's not just in specific in social vulnerability looking at these coastal adaptation plans, but also more broadly in the field of a data gap where socially vulnerable and historically underrepresented communities that might not be getting reported at the same level that is in the data. So we can't necessarily completely rely just on data like the Cal EnviroScreen stuff, even though they are great resources and awesome, really good for us to use as tools and stuff, and they are able to help us analytically analyze it. There is also a lot of anecdotal community level engagement and community level talking to community members that you're going to get levels of social vulnerability come out that we don't necessarily see in some of these things. So yeah.
And not to diminish it, but Cal EnviroScreen is rooted in a pollution framework mostly. So it's which communities are being disproportionately affected by environmental pollution. But adaptation is a different kind of problem in many cases. So what does it mean to not have capacity or to be more vulnerable in a floodplain, for example? And how do we need to understand that and respond to it?
Yeah, thank you, Sam, for that that reiteration of sort of all the different ways you could integrate this type of information into adaptation planning. I think the anecdotal and the meaningful community engagement and getting information that way is really important and something that should be included in these pathways. I thought the social vulnerability index that you mentioned as one of the examples was really interesting. So that sounds like a way that you could kind of quantify some of that information and really get it integrated in a meaningful way to these plans. So yeah, thank you. Next question is, have you witnessed any creative or unique ways to engage the public in the planning phase to form consensus before the implementation of a coastal restoration project? So kind of playing off our last discussion.
That's a good question too. And Sam and Ashley, if you have ideas, feel free. But most of my experience has been in kind of a bureaucratic setting, and some of it goes back to that brief discussion we had about best practices in planning, and that in my mind it always has been about dialogue and hashing it out of sometimes word by word. But if you're talking about policy language, that's one kind of exercise. If you're talking about outcomes in a restoration or a physical context, so I went through some interesting contentious processes like restoration of Malibu Lagoon and how to do that or not, for example, and there's some going on now. But I think one of the more interesting directions that's unfolding is this use of visioning through VR, for example, or just different ways of telling the story of what might happen. And Juliana Klill has done a lot of great work, and others, on developing these virtual reality models where you can see what might sea level look like in this particular place in the future, and then using that to really give people a better appreciation of our shared challenge. And so to me, one of our difficulties, apart from how we imagine the future or see the future, is how do we think about what the challenge is? And I think, unfortunately, our society has gotten away from this idea of shared interest more than it should. And so what are our shared interests? And you need to create processes that allow us to identify what those shared interests are, and then figure out how to realize them better in the future, recognizing that it might have to be some compromise. There might be some trade-offs. But going back to the visioning, I could see a lot of creative possibilities with not just showing what sea level rise is going to look like if it goes up 3 feet, right? That's step one. And we've been doing that for 10 years now in different models, and we're getting pretty good at that. Yeah, the water, it's going to be more water. It's like the first slide on the presentation, like king tide shows us what that looks like. But what are the alternatives for interventions, and what will those look like? Or what could those look like? That's a technical challenge. That's also an imagination challenge. And so I think the interesting methods are going to be the ones that enable different members of the community to enter into a collective visioning process and say, oh, what if we did do that? What would that look like for my kids or my kids' kids? Or what if we did this instead? What would that look like? And so that we can get a little more concrete or not concrete about what the options are.
Yeah, I love that idea of using virtual reality as a way to envision what the possibilities are and get creative. And I think that would be a really effective way to get feedback from folks from many different areas. So I think, yeah,
we could bring some of these entire communities into that new dome in Las Vegas, probably, right?
That would be awesome. Fill up a stadium.
Yeah, I also want to add there's some really great examples of citizen science also being used specifically in some of the monitoring and evaluation aspects of coastal erosion. For example, I think there's a project in Santa Cruz called Coast Snap, where you can like put your phone, they have like stations where you put your phone and they'll like can take a picture and send it to them of like what the shoreline looks like at moments. And it's like for monitor, like it's a great way to involve like the public with monitoring and evaluation of like the shoreline and coastal erosion. So there's examples of that probably all over the California coast. I just thought that might be interesting to add on as well.
I think that's a great point. And for me, that also highlights just engaging with young people, and really young people. Elementary school, middle school, high school engagement with what the challenge is and how to think about it and understand it. And that Coast Snap is a good example of making it a citizen science project.
Yeah, it's their future that we're planning for, right? So that's a great addition to this whole conversation. I'm going to move along, so we have a few more questions to get through in the last 15 minutes or so. We have one more question. It seems that along the coast, you are dealing in terms of sand management. You're looking at, to some degree, at the interrelationships of LCPs within areas such as San Francisco Bay. Actions planned through caps or undertaken in one community could have repercussions for neighboring or even distant communities in terms of issues like flood inundation. So do you have suggestions on how to best deal with these regional issues?
Yeah, I do, but it's not the easy answer. It's both, the answer is both and everything. We need to think about problems at a larger scale And so in San Diego County, any one of those North County cities is not going to solve the sand transport problem or dynamic. They're all contributing in certain ways to it and affecting each other. And so there's a need to have a regional frame to enable those connections to be made and the dialogues to happen around, well, what is the shared interest of that region around sand, for example, and then translate that down to the local level. So there's also integration between local action and regional action, let alone state action. And so we need to invest in both directions, I think, and try to figure out how to structure a dialogue that enables that communication of options and strategies across the boundaries of the different geographies. So some part of me, I think we need to get a little more flexible and start thinking about new forms of governance that enable those connections to be made more easily. Because the problem of specialization and siloed agencies has been around for a long time and has only been increasing. And it's not just a problem with state government. Some of the most bureaucratic processes I've seen have been at the local level, right, between the agencies of local governments. So we need to figure out how to design governance institutions that have a different focus. I know the city of Santa Barbara did a restructuring recently to create a sustainability department. I can't quite remember the title, but cross department focus on sustainability, not planning, public works, and the city manager's office or whatever it is, but a more integrated focus on that problem. So I think if we think about those opportunities and some of the regional mechanisms we have out there, like Beacon or Sandag, maybe some of the geological hazard abatement district notions could become opportunities to do a better job at that. The regional collaboratives, I think, are an excellent movement in that direction, but and sharing information and education is really critical at the ground floor. But at what point do we move into governance? If the right people aren't at the table, with the ability to make decisions about what actually happens, then it's just going to be an overlay of more information, and then the real decisions happen somewhere else.
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge, and kind of goes back to that idea of trying to find a shared goal or shared interest across different scales. It's definitely a difficult.
On that point, I do think, and partly given my experience or past with the Coastal Commission, that should be one of the roles of the state agencies, is to be facilitating that kind of integrative thinking. So the Coastal Commission, for example, is concerned with the coastal zone, which invokes most every issue that you could imagine in terms of land use planning and development, or should anyway. We have a noticeable gap with housing right now, or have for the last 40 years, but there should be thinking about that at the state level to facilitate people at the regional and local levels doing that cross-sector thinking.
Yeah, I'll add for like specifically for the San Francisco Bay Area, a great example of like this regional planning framework, or something that or like an agency looking at the SFA area as a whole and trying to find like commonalities and like some sort of ground for developing like adaptation planning in general. I would highly recommend looking at SFEI's adaptation planning atlas, or their adaptation atlas. They're the ones, they've kind of developed this operational landscape unit where they're kind of categorizing areas of the bay based on the physical and natural geographics of the area of like the region. So they've created a bunch of different OLUs. There's no like they're a great framework, though I will agree with Charles in the sense that there's a what's it called? Like a tension kind of like they don't really have any like jurisdictional like legal authority within those LUs. They're like comprised of different cities and counties in one area. And so there's definitely a lot of work and a lot of things that need to be done to kind of mitigate some of that tension and be able to, well, tension's not even right or but like kind of mitigate these ideas of how can we have regional adaptation planning that has a legal authority or a governance attached to it. So yeah.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to move us along. We have a few more questions we might be able to get through. Does California recommend that local governments use NOAA 2022 sea level rise projections? So those are the ones you showed in your figure. How are local jurisdictions navigating evolving projections and new data in their planning processes?
Well, I think OPC is on the verge of releasing new state guidance, I believe, soon. I don't know, maybe somebody from OPC is on the call. And I don't know for sure, but I suspect that they're going to at least relate to those 2022 projections in some way. And whether they're exactly the same, I'm not certain, but probably would. If I had to guess, they would probably be doing a similar sort of focusing with, you know, in those 2022 projections, the 2050 numbers get more tight because we know more, we're getting better at it. We've eliminated the H++ or the, you know, doomsday, extremely unlikely scenario for 2100. Maybe not after that, but so a tightening of the range. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens with the state. So in terms of the local jurisdictions, Sam showed that one slide of the survey question, which was, you know, I think one of the things we found was when you have a lot of uncertainty and different ways of framing a scientific question. And in the last OPC guidance, there were all the different potential risk scenarios you could pick, which had different numbers at different years. It can be kind of confusing as to what to do. And so I'm hopeful that the next round of guidance will also take a page from the NOAA guidance, which is their implementation guide, or it's a secondary document in the federal document, which is, you know, how should you use this stuff? And my own view is that it's the technical details of exactly how the models are working or what might happen by when is not as important as understanding the potential magnitude and timing of outcomes for the purposes of planning. So if you go back to this idea of we're trying to imagine what kinds of interventions we want to take on our shoreline to address certain contingencies in the future. What's most important, I think, is making sure that you're making a pretty good investment for what you think probably could happen. And think about how you spend your own money. You know, you don't spend a lot of money on things that are extremely unlikely. You spend money on strategies that you think are going to help you deal with things that you think could happen. And if they did happen, you'd be worried about. So understanding the range of possibilities and then using that to structure a conversation about how much should we spend on certain kinds of interventions, while doing that in the context of, is that the kind of intervention we want? You know, do we really want to do that because it would result in this other thing? That's the most important part, I think, of the process. And so we should be thinking about the science is how can it facilitate the framing of that conversation? As opposed to saying, what year and level of sea level rise should we write our plan around? I think we're well past that in California, for the most part, but I do think it's a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah. On the topic of different types of interventions, we have a question. Did the report evaluate communities that have effectively employed managed retreat policies for existing development?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Did the report, so your report, evaluate communities that effectively employed managed retreat policies? So did you look at whether communities have actually done managed retreat for policies in existing development?
I don't think so. If you guys have something comes to mind, let me know. There aren't really very many examples, depending on what you consider that to be. I did work on a piece year and a half or so ago, looking at what I would consider to be examples of managed forms of managed retreat in California. I can send you that link, Jessica, if you want to send it out later, which looks at actual cases where I would call managed retreat as happening. But just to clarify from the report, the point we were making was not so much that it's happening, but that it's being considered and evaluated in a lot more than the conversation that we've been having in the political social media context would suggest. So, the dialogue has been, oh my God, managed retreat, we're never going to do that. Oh, we need to rebrand it. Who would ever do managed retreat? But when you look at the plans and the studies, it's actually being thought about at a level of technical detail more than you might think. Whether we actually do it, I think, we'll see.
But it's being considered.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. I'll pose one more. I know we're getting really close to our 12:30 ending time. So maybe we'll just go with one more question. I'm going to go to this last question because I think it's a nice ending question. I would love to hear from all the presenters if after this study, they are hopeful for future sea level rise adaptation in California or not. Did anything during the course of their analysis report change their thinking about the state of adaptation in California?
I'm going to defer to Ashley and Sam on that. I'm interested in that answer too.
I don't think you would necessarily be in this field if you weren't optimistic in some capacity. But I would say, for me, one of the things, looking at the survey analysis across 4 different surveys dating back to 2006, one marked change is that in 2006, respondents were split between whether or not climate change was even occurring, and especially on what the causes were. And in our most recent survey, there's unanimous agreement that climate change is occurring. Vast majority of respondents agree that it's human caused. And also, so I think that in terms of like coming to a consensus about what these issues are and where we are is progress, maybe not as fast as we would like or even need. And then the other thing that makes me hopeful is just the way in which individuals are coming to the table and envisioning adaptation planning and sea level rise planning all together. There's a lot of work to do, and I think that's one of the takeaways from our analysis, but it's looking to engage a much broader group of constituents, and obviously there will be missteps and falters along the way, but I think the more people we can bring to the table to address these issues, the better solutions and the more comprehensive solutions we're going to come up with.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Ashley in that we would probably not, no one in this field is really, we all have like a sense of urgency and a sense of like hopefulness for the future in terms of climate adaptation planning as a whole, and specifically for us, sea level rise adaptation planning. I personally am very hopeful for the future of it. I think that for me, one of the things that I first of all agreeing with Ashley on terms of like there are more people being brought to the table, and that is like a huge that's a huge sense of the hope, huge reason for the hopefulness. But in addition to that, I also just think like we look at some of these adaptation planning like documents, and in the past and the future, there's been so much done in the past like 10 years. Like I showed that chart of vulnerability assessments, and it just like went way up in 2016, and there's still more to do. And even if the adaptation planning and like the local LCP updates and stuff have not quite been there, they're just like parts of the adaptation planning process, and we're just going through the motions kind of in steps. But there is a sense of urgency, I think, with all of this. Like the results of our study kind of indicate like this is something that cities really and jurisdictions really do need to consider in their climate adaptation planning. And I think that sense of urgency, plus like a sense of passion, plus the ideas of there are more people being brought to the table, plus there's just so much more that can be done, does in fact make me like very, very hopeful for the future of adaptation planning. And hopefully we get it done in time. But yeah, that's kind of where I land, just with a sense of hope, which is good.
Thank you.
Well, I guess what makes me most hopeful is hearing that these guys are hopeful. Sam's right. What the overall conclusion is, like, it might look like we haven't gotten very far, but we've done a ton of work in California. And just when you read through all these plans and studies, and you realize, the money's not just being thrown away, it's going to good, solid work, and we're understanding what's happening better, and we are reaching more people, and the dialogue's becoming more sophisticated and nuanced. The part of me that's not hopeful is that, this is just California, right? This is California's coast, like the bluest blue strip in the country. And so how are we going to translate this to meaningful action at a larger scale that's actually going to deal with this urgency that's real? So I don't know, that didn't really convey hope necessarily, but I think it's really important for people to stay engaged in it and think about the intergenerational frame and the shared interest frame. Because if we don't broaden our thinking to beyond ourselves, then I'm not hopeful.
Yeah, thank you for all those closing thoughts. I think it can be overwhelming as someone who works in this field to think about all the challenges. So it's nice to hear some notes of optimism with a healthy dose of cynicism. So thank you for that.
Yes.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for questions.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for answering so many questions and this amazing discussion. I learned a lot, so I'm sure everyone here did.
All of us are happy to answer further emails, or if people have questions or want to talk about any of the issues.
Great. Thank you. Well, yeah, I will be following up with an email, including some of the slides and the link to this recording so you can review or share beyond. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really a pleasure. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Jessica. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.